Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles on all of our shows and welcome special guests. And we've got a returning guest this time, and it's Glenn Greenberg, who is the, let's call him now the king of the bookazines. When you have your own Beatles library and you'll have shelves just for books, make sure there's one shelf at least just for the bookazines. And I guarantee you over half of them will probably be Glenn's. He has written several of them on the Beatles, one on John Lennon, which is the only one that I don't have, actually. But he followed that with this one, Paul McCartney at 80 for when he turned 80 years old. And recently he put out this one, the trivia book of the Beatles. And we had him on the channel for both the McCartney issue and the trivia issue. And now he has another new one, The Making of the Beatles White Album, right here. And you can find this at pharmacies. Where else, Glenn?
Barnes and Noble,
Barnes and Noble.
bookstores, grocery stores, supermarkets, and you can also order it directly from the publisher, which is A360 at magazineshop.us. And you just type in Beatles in the search function, and it'll take you right to their little Beatles library, and the White Album will be among them.
Okay, very good. So we're just going to talk about the White Album here. And maybe a little bit of news at the end.
Sure.
Okay. But my first question is the obvious one. I mean, to me, every Beatles album is a great album. Why did you choose to do one on the White Album?
Well, part of it is a simple reason. It's the 55th anniversary. And so when you do these bookazines, you either do it in years that end with a 0 or years that end with a 5. And so my publisher also did the same year. They did a bookazine based on With the Beatles, because it's the 60th anniversary of With the Beatles. So they did both. And I had my pick of the litter, and I decided to go with the White Album. So that was really the reason, the motivating reason for to doing it in the first place, was that it is the 55th anniversary.
Right.
And it was just a matter of deciding what the format was going to be and how to present it, and what the thesis was going to be.
Right.
And that was me.
Between 1963, you also got Please Please Me in there, and 1973, where you got 5 big selling solo Beatle albums. There's a lot of material there that you could have done bookazines on.
Right.
So, but anyway, where the White Album is concerned, I love what is said here in the introduction as to why we love the White Album. You write, in following Sgt. Pepper, given the band's ethos, the one thing the new album was definitely not going to be was Sgt. Pepper 2. They were determined not to repeat themselves. That's one of the reasons why we love the Beatles. And they were constantly changing, and maybe some of the changes were more gradual and some of them were more stark, say Rubber Soldier Revolver, for example. But yeah, that's one of the many reasons why we admire the Beatles so much. And quite a distinction between the White Album and Sgt. Pepper right there.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a completely different direction. It was a very conscious one. They did not want to do another psychedelic album, and they definitely did not. They went in a completely different direction, and I think that was to be expected of them. Throughout their career, their whole drive was not to repeat themselves, not to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So, I mean, the simplest and the easiest thing in the world would have been to just do another Sgt. Pepper, just continue. And even though it wasn't a full album, you can almost make the case that the Magical Mystery Tour album was only released as an album in the US, but that was kind of a Sgt. Pepper too, to a certain extent. So, but in terms of sitting down and recording an album, they weren't going to just continue where they had left off. No matter what album they were going to do next, it was not going to be Sgt. Pepper 2. And yeah.
Yeah, no matter what, you always saw some kind of growth in the Beatles from album to album, and even with singles. I mean,
yeah,
Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields,
Yep.
That's kind of a contrast, I suppose, to All You Need Is Love, which you could also say is psychedelic, but still
Right.
there was always growth in the band.
Hmm.
And I always think of, well, when it comes to Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, when the videos were shown on American Bandstand,
But
and the fans were in the audience and they're like, just the look of the Beatles, it was so different at that point.
yeah.
So they weren't always changing musically. They were always changing musically, but
Right.
they were also changing in their appearances too.
Right.
Also,
And not always being embraced by the fans. The fans were like taken aback and not necessarily in a good way.
right. Well, I've made the case here. Certainly when 66 came around and Revolver was very different, although it's even more different when you listen to the British album than the American
Hmm.
album.
Yep.
But there were some fans that felt that was too drastic a change at that point. And for some of those fans, they gravitated more towards the Monkees, which kind of kept seriously. And I
Yeah.
know you love the Monkees too, but
Yeah.
they kind of in the very beginning, they were very much, it fit right in with 1965, 66 music,
Right.
stylistically. Whereas the Beatles were just, come on, Tomorrow Never Knows.
Hmm.
What did they do before that was close to Tomorrow Never Knows?
Nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. Yeah. And you kind of have that with the White Album with, we'll get more in depth into it later, I'm sure. But, I mean, I would say could make the case that Revolution 9 is to the White Album what Tomorrow Never Knows was to Revolver.
Okay. All right. We should point out that one of the things that I like about your book of zines is that it caters to a more casual fan.
Hmm.
If you're really hardcore, you probably know all this material, but to people that haven't fully studied it, you're going to learn some things that you probably never knew before. So I should point that out to people, especially to new fans that are
Yeah.
that are coming up. A book of zine like this should be right up your alley. Okay. In the first chapter or so, I wanted to get your take on what John Lennon said, which you quote him on in Rolling Stone. It was just me and a backing group, Paul and a backing group. Okay. There are a lot of people who look at the White Album as being the start of a real division within the group because there are a lot of songs on there that didn't have all four of them on it. And that was nothing new for the Beatles, but
Hmm.
there was more of it on the White Album. There were songs that had one, two, or three Beatles, but
Yeah. Roughly half the album.
and so for John to think this way, whatever was his song, he had his backing group, whatever was Paul's song. How do you look at that quote from John?
Well, John tended to exaggerate. John tended to look at things in extreme terms. I don't think, especially after doing the research for this, I don't think it was as stark as he made it out to be. And a lot of the research and the source material that has since come forth in recent years has kind of put John's assertion to rest that it wasn't as bad. There were a lot of group moments. There were a lot of happy moments. There were a lot of moments of cooperation and camaraderie. Um, uh, and so no, I think that's probably how John was thinking about it at the time. John was in a really bad state of mind during that 1970 interview with Jan Wenner.
Mhm.
He was angry at everybody except Yoko, and uh, uh, and so yeah, I mean, I think he was looking back with anger, and so everything was colored by that frame of mind of his. But no, I don't think it was as divisive and as angry and as separate an individual of a period as he's made it out to be. On the same token, as I argue in the book, the seeds are planted
Mm.
for the solo careers, and you can, I mean, it's undeniable. The seeds for Paul McCartney becoming a one-man band for his first solo album. It's
Mhm.
right there. There were two or three songs where he just went off and performed all of it by himself. John taking his anger and all of his like angst and his his animosity and putting it into a song. That's on the White Album, and he'll do it again on Plastic Ono Band, and he'll do it on Imagine.
Right.
Uh, at one of his former bandmates at that point,
Hmm.
and you see George starting to blossom, and you see Ringo starting to take up songwriting. So yes, the seeds for their individuality are planted on the White Album, but it is not an album where they are breaking up. And I think I make that case pretty successfully.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in your issue here, because I interviewed Ken Scott many years ago,
Mhm.
and he said from what he observed, they were a band like any other band that had
Right.
arguments. It's only because it's the Beatles and the biggest band in the world that it can get blown out of proportion. But
Exactly.
what you just said about how John was negative in this regard towards the White Album, isn't it kind of similar to what he was saying about Let It Be?
Well, it wasn't just John. To be fair to John, I think everybody looked at the Let It Be
That's
era
true.
in the same way. George Martin was talking about it very shortly after those sessions wrapped,
Hmm.
saying that he never thought they would get back together again. George looked back on that period very as optimistic as George was going into those sessions. He was very negative coming out of them. I think it eventually colored Paul's perspective until he saw the Peter Jackson documentary, and so
Right.
it wasn't that bad. And I think Ringo too. I remember hearing Ringo saying, Ringo being the wit that he is.
Hmm.
He said by that point I was just hoping we'd all just let it be. You know.
Uh-huh.
So they were all remembering that period in negative ways. It wasn't just John. Although, see, here's the thing, and I do mention it in the book. George, by the time they were into the Let It Be sessions, George was looking favorably at the White Album sessions. He
Mhm.
described them as a period where he was really trying to contribute and really trying to be a part of the whole process. So he, as soon as like January '69, George is looking back on the White Album sessions as a really good period for him. It was Paul who specifically was looking back and saying, I never want to go through that again.
Hmm.
Even John, as negatively as he was looking back on the White Album sessions, was really proud of the work that came out of it. I mean, he liked the White Album.
Mhm.
And one of the things that a case that he made in public several times was that, part of the problem with Paul was that he didn't like the White Album. The rest of them did. So it was interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. You really have to get the perspective of all four of them
Yeah.
and how they can change their opinions and say completely different things because nothing is black and white.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
said, John was very proud of the White Album. That was more to his liking in terms
Hmm.
of the band being strictly the band without so much production like on Sergeant Pepper. Maybe he also felt a little bit of jealousy because of Paul getting so much credit for Sergeant Pepper.
Hmm.
And where the White Album's concerned, it was a lot more balance between Lennon songs and McCartney songs on the White Album.
Right.
So, on the one hand, he preferred the White Album, but, and then at the same time, he was negative about the White Album. Yeah. So, and it's funny what you say about George Harrison, because yes, I know that George was frustrated during Sergeant Pepper, like he wasn't doing all that much.
Hmm.
But certainly before Sergeant Pepper, in terms of his musicianship and as a guitar player and everything, he was contributing quite a lot to
Yep.
Beatles songs. So maybe that's more a reaction to Sergeant Pepper than anything else.
That probably was. I mean, as much as George griped about always having no more than two songs per album, he got three songs onto Revolver,
Mm-hmm.
and my understanding is that part of the reason why he never reached that plateau again was for a while he had pulled back. He had lost interest in being a Beatle, and so he wasn't putting forth that much stuff. And the stuff that he was putting forward was kind of second rate stuff. And so I think that George probably kind of missed the boat at the wrong time. I mean, he kind of lost interest in the Beatles at the wrong time because
Hmm.
on the heels of Revolver, he got three songs on that album, and
Right.
one of them was one of his Indian songs. I mean, it was as unbeatle like as could be. And so, had he been able to keep the momentum going, I think he wouldn't have been in such a negative spot for himself.
Interesting. Um, on the subject of George, there's a very simple quote here from Paul that I think is extremely powerful. This is in chapter 1, Odyssey in India,
Mm-hmm.
where in going to see the Maharishi's lecture in London and then a 10-day seminar in Bangor, Wales, Paul McCartney said, George wants it, but one of us wants, the others go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, George Harrison's very frustrated in the fact that John and Paul and George Martin are not giving him the kind of respect that he feels he deserves with his songwriting. And yet, when something like this is that important to George, all four of them go along with it
Right.
and travel. So I think that shows that there was still a lot of unity within the band, and it meant a lot that they were very much a group effort in what they were doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the fact that they spent so much of their private lives together, it puts the lie to the cynics and the revisionists who say, "Oh, they were never that close. They were bound to each other financially, and they weren't really friends. They used each other because they."
Hmm.
No, you don't get into the religion and spending your free time with these people if there isn't a sense of brotherhood and love and family.
Right.
If you want a band that's really together because it's in their best financial interests. I mean, that's the Who. These guys did not hang out with each other when they were not in the studio and when they were
Uh-huh.
not on tour. I mean, the Stones became that too, to a large extent. The split between Mick and Keith. They're involved with each other's lives professionally because they have to be. But the Beatles, for the longest time, they were a family. They really were.
Mm-hmm. Oh
Which
yeah.
is why it's so heartbreaking that the way it ended the way it did.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. Um, so let's talk about the state of each Beatle
Right.
during the White Album. And where John is concerned, Yoko is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yoko is everywhere.
Yeah.
And she's even making suggestions to the
Yeah.
songs during the White Album, which is making Paul and George uncomfortable.
Right.
And that had never happened before. So that was a big change in the way that they worked together at that
Mm-hmm.
moment. You want to elaborate a little bit more of how Paul and George handled that?
Well, George, and this is according to John, and I think George has all but confirmed it, was that George was the most negative towards Yoko, even right to her face. I mean, supposedly he said, I don't remember the exact quote, so I'll have to paraphrase it a little bit, but like, the word from Dylan and the New York crew is that, you give off really negative vibes, really bad vibes. And it's something that John remembered a few years later, and regrets not punching George right then and there.
Hmm.
That George was the most openly negative towards Yoko. Paul, it seems, was a little more standoffish, but was a lot more understanding and accommodating than I think he's been given credit for over the years. And I think that again, the release of the Get Back documentary
Hmm.
and the surfacing of a lot of the Nagra tapes from those Let It Be sessions really show that Paul was kind of bending over backwards to
Hmm.
accommodate John and was being as understanding and as open to Yoko as he could possibly be, but also griping by the fact that it was inhibiting his songwriting with John, which is fair,
Right.
absolutely fine and fair. Uh, I I think that we've since come to the understanding that Paul didn't like her being there, but he was willing to put up with it. George was more resentful,
Hmm.
and openly so.
Okay. And Paul was also aware that as Yoko was becoming more and more important to John, I mean, she was everything to him.
Mm-hmm.
if John had to pick between her and the Beatles, he'd pick Yoko.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, he definitely said that during the Let It Be sessions. I don't know if he was cognizant of that during the White Album sessions, only because those conversations, aren't on record for us to hear. So
Right.
when Paul came to that realization, I mean, maybe it was when John said to him, "Look, if I have to choose between you and her, it's going to be her every time." That was said during the Let It Be sessions. I don't know if that's the moment that Paul came to that realization,
Hmm.
but it's certainly a realization that he eventually came to. I think some of my research about the White Album sessions showed that John was very erratic during those during those sessions. He and Yoko were getting hooked on heroin, and so
Right.
his behavior was very volatile. They were walking on eggshells around him because they weren't sure what was going to set him off.
Hmm.
So that kind of colored the whole thing as well. So I don't know. I don't know if Paul was really thinking about, well, if he has to choose between us and her, I don't know if that was really at the forefront of his mind during that period yet.
Yeah. Before we continue about the sessions, we really should talk about when the Beatles were in India, because it was extraordinary how much material they wrote.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, it's like 3 dozen songs, something like that,
Yeah.
between John, Paul, and George. And it
Hmm.
just goes to show you sometimes a change of environment can really stimulate you and make you more creative. And it's just, and some of that material didn't end up on the White Album,
Right.
ended up on Abbey Road or in some of the solo releases. So, it's pretty extraordinary given that short time that they were with the Maharishi, that they were able to come up with so much material. And actually, one thing that I found really interesting in your bookazine is that George Harrison was very frustrated with John and Paul because, according to George, they were there to meditate and to learn how to meditate. And according to George, John and Paul were more concerned about songwriting.
Right. Yes. And this is one of the things, because you had mentioned earlier how this bookazine is really great for people who aren't so deep in the weeds with regard to the Beatles,
Hmm.
that it's it appeals to general audiences who may not know the ins and the outs. And one of the things that I think really comes through in this bookazine, and it even became much more clear to me as I was sitting down and sifting through all this material and putting it all into the proper context, is if there's no India, there's no White Album.
Hmm.
Now, the Beatles would have put out another album after Sgt. Pepper. I mean, that goes without saying. They
Hmm.
would have done another album. It would not have been this album, because India, their experiences in India, their experiences leading up to the trip to India, um, fed so many of the songs for that album
Right.
that we wouldn't have gotten those songs. It's roughly 1/3 of the songs on the White Album were inspired by or written in India. And so you would have had a very, very, I mean, obviously some of the songs would have ended up on the White Album no matter what,
Hmm.
but some of the best songs wouldn't have, because they wouldn't have been written.
Very true. You got to take a look at, say, Bungalow Bill or
Bungalow Bill, Dear
Dear
Prudence,
Prudence. Yeah.
why don't we do it in the road? I will. Your blues, I'm so tired. Mother Nature's son.
Hmm.
Excuse me. Everybody's got something to hide except me and my monkey. Sexy Sadie.
Right.
And even going a little bit further, Jealous Guy was
Hmm.
originally on the
Child
road
of
to
Nature.
Rishikesh. Yeah, Child of
Yeah.
Nature.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that's quite a significant chunk of material that would never have seen the light of day had India not have happened. So who knows what shape the White Album would have taken had that trip not occurred.
And also, it should be noted that while a lot of fans might look at the White Album as being one where there was a lot of division within the group
Mhm.
because they were recording 2 songs separately in different studios, a lot of that is because they had a deadline
Right.
to meet.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. Is they were rushing to get this thing done for a November release,
Hmm.
and they had started recording in May 31st, 1968. They started with Revolution.
Hmm.
And in the midst of all that, they recorded "Hey Jude" and and they were still writing songs too. As a matter of fact, they did 102 sessions for
Not guilty.
Not Guilty, which didn't even make it on the album. So yeah, which is another song that was kind of inspired by India as well.
Right.
So yeah, it was to say that they were recording in separate studios because they weren't getting along is a real representation of what was going on. They were scrambling to get that album done. Partly, and I didn't mention this in the book because I felt like it would have taken us down a whole rabbit hole.
Hmm.
But the understanding now is that part of the reason why they insisted on doing it as a double album was to fulfill the terms of their contract.
Right.
And so they would be in a much better negotiating position to renew their contracts. So get it all out in one shot, and then boom, we're in a position we can dictate our own terms.
Yeah, they wanted to get a certain number of songs out there,
Right.
specifically. So you had 30 tracks on the White Album, so I'm sure that was enough to fulfill
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
that point their obligations.
Mhm.
Let's talk about Paul a little bit here, because right around that time he had broken up with Jane Asher, and she had announced that on BBC television.
Right.
There is a quote here. You probably have the source in there. I didn't write it down. And I know I read this before from Derek Taylor, where he said, "I don't think I ever hated anyone as much as I hated Paul in the
Yeah.
summer of '68. Now, I would think, bouncing off of Sergeant Pepper, where Paul McCartney, as all the Beatles, are being praised here, but a lot of people are pointing to Paul as being like a mastermind behind the whole concept behind Sergeant Pepper, that he was on such a high that you would have thought he wouldn't be a problem to work with." Why do you suppose Derek Taylor made that statement? Was it maybe because of the breakup with Jane? Any idea?
I think he was under a lot of. I mean, one of the things that when people are tend to talk about the White Album, tend to talk about that period of time, they only talk about the creative end, but you also have to factor in the business end.
Yeah.
And Paul was under a hell of a lot of pressure during that time, because not only was he recording an album with the Beatles, not only was his the guy began the White Album sessions engaged to one woman, and he ended the sessions deeply involved with another woman. So a lot of turmoil going on. But the other key thing was Apple. I mean, Apple, even by the summer of '68, when they were still in the midst of recording the White Album, Apple was already in trouble. And Paul tried to assume control of the company and get spending under control and all that, and was having a lot of difficulty. It was beyond his ability. He wasn't a businessman. None of them were. And so he was under a lot of pressure. And when you're under that kind of pressure and you feel like you don't have control over the situation, there can be the tendency to lash out at people. And he was lashing out, and he was becoming, and as he was becoming more and more insecure because he wasn't able to control the situation, he began to get very arrogant about it, and started treating the exec. Supposedly he was great to the lower level staff, the regular staff at Apple. The secretaries never complained about him. It was the executives. Supposedly there was one meeting where Paul lined them all up and said, "You're all not very good, are you?" That kind of thing. And so I think that was the environment that was going on at the time. And I think that's chiefly what Derek Taylor was referring to, is that Paul was becoming really insufferable. And as he was seeing failure around him at Apple, he was sort of elevating himself and sort of wondering, why can't you get things under control? I hired you to run this company, to handle this company. Why are you failing me? There's lots of people like that. That's who react that way under those circumstances. And, Paul apparently was one of them.
Yeah. It's kind of fascinating. The Beatles should get some credit for trying to create uh, really basically a conglomerate.
Yeah.
They were so much more than just Apple Records, but that also turned out to be a problem for them because there was too much where they were not businessmen, like you said. They had a closed division that failed very quickly.
Right.
They had Apple Electronics, Apple Films. It was way too much,
Yeah.
for people that never had anything to do with business before to take it on themselves.
And it wasn't meant to be that. It was meant to really be a tax shelter
Mm,
originally. And I can't help but think that had Brian Epstein lived, that would have been his main function for the Beatles going forward. If they kept him on.
yeah,
And I think there's reason to believe they would have kept him on. Um, he was worried because they had stopped touring. So, what is that? Where does that leave him if he's not managing the tours and arranging the tours and all that? Where would that leave him? And I think that there's a very good chance that he would have been overseeing Apple for them, and that would have been his main function. And they would worry about recording, and that would have been it. But the way George described it, George Harrison, was that's what he thought it was going to be, a tax shelter. And then all of a sudden, John and Paul are going around saying, well, it's going to be this, and it's going to be that, and it's going to be this, and it's going to be that. And, come to us, bring us your tired, you're poor, you're hungry, your talents, and we will give you money, and you will walk away, and you will be. And George was like, I didn't sign up for any of this. And so
right.
he really distanced himself from all that. So that was, perhaps Apple turned into what ultimately was an unforced error, because it didn't have to be that. That's not what it was originally meant to be. And that caused a lot of pressure that otherwise might not have been there.
Hmm. Okay, I'm going to read a quote here from Linda
Okay.
McCartney,
Yeah.
um, just to describe what she had observed at the sessions at the time for the White Album. She said they were obviously going through a bad time. Everybody was obviously growing up and growing away a bit. The Beatles was Paul's job. He and John were a creative team, but John was with Yoko. Paul never had any time alone with John. It was John and Yoko and the other Beatles. I always love Linda's quotes because she's just so frank. She
Yeah.
just tells it like it is. And yeah, it really kind of explained what was going on at the time. You meant,
Linda was great. I mean, that 1984 Playboy interview with Paul and Linda, she was great. I mean, she was fantastic. She really gave some terrific insights. So yeah, she's definitely one that you get some great quotes from her.
he would sometimes say things that Paul would kind of be reluctant to say.
Right.
She would
Right.
kind of be his mouthpiece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So since you mentioned Not Guilty,
Right.
it certainly you read the lyrics and it's all about their trip to India and George saying, "Don't blame me for what happened." Um, is
Yeah.
that the reason why you believe it didn't make the White Album, or they just weren't pleased with any of the takes?
I can't imagine that it took them 102 takes to realize, oh, this is about us. I think that they spent a lot of time on that song. It's the one song that they recorded more takes of than any other song in their catalog.
Hmm.
I think that ultimately they probably just weren't happy with the way it turned out. That it wasn't coming together the way that, no pun intended, the way they wanted it to. I don't think that it took them that long to realize, oh, this is really too internal, and this is too personal, and that's why it was ultimately left off. It wasn't only about don't blame me for India. It was also,
Hmm.
I want my piece of the pie also.
Right.
If this is a 4-man unit, and I only want what I can get. That's it's like that's what he's saying. I won't upset the apple cart. I only want what I can get. He wants his slice too. He wants to carve out a nice little niche for himself. Um, I don't think that the lyrics. I know it's been speculated that that's why,
Hmm.
but they would have had to have been really dense to get to take 182, mix it, finish it, and go, nah, these lyrics are too personal.
They must have thought highly of the song if they put
Yeah.
that much effort behind it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the same way it's a misnomer that they rejected All Things Must Pass. They didn't. They did like 78 takes of that. It was George who withdrew All Things Must Pass from the final lineup for Let It Be or Get Back, whatever it was called at the time. So yeah, I mean, there wasn't as much of a disrespect or disregard for George's material as I think that's been made out to be over the years. Well, I mean, certainly his stuff was not going to be held as much of a priority as John and Paul's stuff, but I don't think that it was quite as bad as it's been made out to be. You don't spend 78 takes and 102 takes on a guy's music if you think he's rubbish, as they would say.
Well, George did say it was a struggle to get his songs in there.
I'm sure it was, but I don't believe it was I don't believe that it was as bad as it was made out to be.
Now, that's the thing with the Beatles. Things can easily be overblown.
Right.
So you don't quite know how to take some of the information that you're given. And, you know, many years ago, I observed that John wasn't on a lot of George's songs.
Right.
And then you start wondering what's going on there.
Right. And then you hear the conversations that have leaked over the years, the recordings that have leaked, and you hear George taking John to task for that. And then John's knee-jerk reaction is, well, you didn't need us. You know, you were doing the Indian stuff, and I didn't need to be there. Well, Paul was there.
Yeah.
You know, Paul contributed. You know, and it's the same thing. It's like during this same conversation that I'm quoting, there was a point where I personally fully believe that Paul was trying to pay George a compliment, where he said that up until now, George's stuff hasn't been as good as ours, but as of this year, George's stuff is at least as good as ours, which means, I mean, Paul's giving some leeway that it might even be better. And George took that as an insult.
Well, if you think about the first part of what he said.
True,
but there's a lot of great stuff that George did from the very beginning on. It's not like it wasn't until While My Guitar Gently Weeps that he gave us a great song, you know.
Agreed, but if that's Paul's opinion and he's entitled to it, you know. But when he's saying his stuff is now at least as good as ours, I mean, that's a compliment, and needs to be sort of, you know, accepted as such. And yet George took it as an insult. So it just seems like there was a lot of extreme reactions to things between them at that point.
The relationship between John, Paul, and George is very complex.
Yes.
So, and it's fascinating. You know,
yes.
On the one hand, sometimes I think Paul and George is far more complex than John and Paul.
Yes. Yes.
So, and you wonder why, but then you also read quotes like you have from George Harrison that when Paul wrote one of his songs, he had very definite ideas of what he wanted, whereas John was more flexible and he took ideas from other people. So in that way, he found it easier to work with John. And yet Paul was there for just about every one of George's songs, unless he wasn't needed, like Within You, Without You, you know?
Right. And he made incredible contributions. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
You know, the piano on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the background vocals, you know, he was there for, you know, long and Savoy. I mean, all the stuff, and then going in all the way up to Abbey Road, the terrific contributions that he made to Something.
Yeah.
Again, if you don't really value the person, you don't put that much effort in. You know, you kind of leave him to his own devices. But Paul was there. And their relationship was incredibly complex right up until the end. And the only sort of solace I, as a lifelong Beatles fan, can take from it is that they did seem to mend fences at the end, George and Paul, and have the kind of closure and have the kind of I'm trying to think of the right word, but have the kind of coming together as solace and resolution that certainly George didn't have with John, and I think to a certain extent Paul didn't get with John either. Paul certainly was on better terms with John when John died than George was. But I think with George and Paul, there was an opportunity to say goodbye and to say I love
And
you.
yeah, and that helps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we
I
should
don't
all
think.
have that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Paul looks back. You know, again, I can't speak for Paul. I mean, we haven't spoken in a while, but I have to imagine that Paul doesn't look back and feel like there was anything left unsaid between him and George, that he didn't get, that he didn't get a chance to have that sense of resolution and a chance to say goodbye.
Yeah, there's a lot of fans out there who are of the opinion that George really hated Paul. And
Mm,
like I said, every relationship is complicated, especially when you have all this history, and they did so
yeah.
much together. There's no way you can't live through what the Beatles lived through and not love each other. It's
Hmm.
just absolutely impossible. You have to have feelings that are really deep. But there was one Beatle fan who said this to me and said, well, Paul was never on any of George's albums, aside from all those years ago.
Hmm.
But I mean, so that's proof right there. But maybe, George loved Paul, but he didn't want to work with him. That's all.
I
It's
think that
that's
I think you're probably closer to the mark than other people would be. There is an interview with George. This would have been in the late '80s, where they were talking about Paul,
mhm,
and the subject of "Give My Regards to Broad Street" came up,
yeah.
and George said, I've been in the movie business for, how many years at that point. You'd think that if Paul wanted to make a movie, he could pick up the phone and ask me for some advice. I could have said to him, don't do this, do this, do this. And he never did.
Uh-huh.
So, I think that there was an openness to George that he would have helped him if Paul had asked for it. Um, on the same token, I think that musically speaking, I think he felt like he didn't want Paul on his solo albums for the most part, because I think he wanted to prove that he could just do it on his own. I think
Mm.
that he didn't want Paul. I think there was he felt like Paul did have a tendency to take over and to sort of become very domineering, and he just didn't want to deal with that on his own albums. You're right. He did ask Paul to be on all those years ago, and Paul had
Paul,
Paul wanted him to be on Wanderlust
right.
for Tug of War, and George backed out at the last minute for whatever reason.
Mm.
So I think that he was very uncomfortable being in a musical kind of relationship with Paul, but in
Right.
terms of relating to each other outside of the studio, outside of playing music, I think George was okay with Paul for the most part.
And there was that time when Cloud Nine came out, and Paul was saying, I'm thinking about maybe writing a song with George.
Yeah,
And then George would say, that's funny. In all these years, he's had
right.
all these years to ask me, and now all of a sudden he's asking me.
Right. I mean, yeah, it really went. It was very mercurial, very mercurial. And yeah, I've also heard, and I've researched it enough to know it may well be true. Okay,
Uh-huh.
was that Paul was asked to be in the walrus costume in the "When We Were Fab" video,
Uh-huh.
and he couldn't do it. He was otherwise, occupied. He couldn't make it. But he said, well, just tell him that it was me, and I won't say anything to the contrary. Let him
Okay.
think it was me.
All
And
right.
so yeah, there was even that consideration that maybe Paul would have shown up if he was available. So there was communication going on. There was dialogue. They were getting along for the most part. It was the business stuff and the music stuff, I think, that was a source of tension between them. So no, I don't believe that George hated Paul. I just think that he needed to deal with Paul under very certain conditions
Hmm.
because of the history.
And how do you feel? I mean, I'm breaking away here from the White Album, but the whole controversy about the Beatles anthology, that George only got involved because he needed the money, because he lost so much money with handmade films. Because a lot of people will say, if you watch when the three of them are together, there are times when George looks like he doesn't want to be there.
Yep, I agree. There are times where he looks like he doesn't want to be there. There are times when Paul tries to, kid around with George, and George glares at the camera. You ever see that bit?
Yeah.
And yeah, during the jam session, when they're all on the stools, and Ringo's on the little drum kit,
Yeah.
and they're singing together, you can tell that George is just like, let's play a short version. Let's just kind of get this done. Yeah, I think that look, it may have been because he was in Paul's orbit, or it may have just been because he doesn't want to relive the Beatles.
Right.
That could have been a part of it also. The bits where George is the most comfortable is when he's by himself and he's relating stories, that about the past, but that aren't so Beatle heavy.
Right.
And so those are the best bits with George in the anthology. I think that, yeah, maybe the fact that he had suffered some financial loss was a big motivating force for him participating in the anthology. He's not around to say otherwise, and he's not around to set us straight. It's speculation. I think it was possibly a motivating force. I'd like to think it wasn't the only one.
Yeah, well, I've often said, and since we don't have George to say anything, and Olivia, I don't think has ever commented on this, or
No.
Danny. You would think that for something as important as the anthology, he'd want to have his voice heard.
I agree.
And his point of view and how we observe the whole history of the Beatles. And if he wasn't in the Beatles anthology, well, first of all, they wouldn't have done it without him in it.
Right.
So, and he would have looked very bad if it was found out that he didn't want to do it. So, and he probably also didn't want the Beatles anthology to be more Paul's version.
Right. I mean, the Beatles anthology started out life as a documentary film that Neil Aspinall was going to be putting together.
Right.
John talked about it in his last interviews. And at the time, the project was going to be called The Long and Winding Road.
Yep.
And the rumor is that George put his foot down and said it is not going to be named after a Paul song. So George knew that this was in the ether. He knew it was in the works. I mean, his biggest objection was that it was going to be called The Long and Winding Road. So yeah, I tend to think that he would have been involved, and maybe it would have taken longer to sort of needle him into submitting to it.
Right.
But I do think that the financial situation was a motivating force.
Okay.
I do believe that. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the songs on the White Album here.
Sure.
For Back in the USSR, you have a quote from Mike Love. He said, "I told McCartney that what he ought to do is talk the girls all around Russia, the Ukraine, and Georgia. He was plenty creative not to need any lyrical help from me, but I gave him the idea for that little section." Which is nice. It's also influenced by Chuck Berry, too.
Yep.
He had his song Back in the USA. So, Glass Onion, we know Lennon wrote because of fans overanalyzing Beatle lyrics. He wanted to send them on a wild goose chase.
It's one of my favorite songs on the album.
Oh, yeah. Happiness is a Warm Gun, 3 unfinished songs, all rolled into one. Rocky Raccoon, you said some lyrical contributions came from Lennon and Donovan?
Yeah.
Where did you find that out? I wasn't aware about. I know Donovan was there during the whole India thing and teaching all that guitar style and all.
Right. I'd have to go back to my notes and my original manuscript where all of that stuff is cited. But I believe that, many years from now, the Paul McCartney biography by Barry Miles,
Right.
I think that gets into it a little bit. I found an interview with Donovan, I think, where he talked about it. And Paul was very forthcoming about that as well.
Okay. Have to go back and reread many years from now.
Right.
Yeah. Sexy Sadie, inspired by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, I've Been Good to You.
Yeah.
Which actually opens with the words, "Look what you've done. You made a fool out of someone." Close to what John wrote. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That was. Where did you discover that?
Again, I've got a
Yeah.
voluminous library of Beatle books, and so I was consulting and cross checking, and so it was in one of them. It all becomes a blur when it's like months later and you haven't really thought about it because you're working on your next project. Yeah.
Right. Well, there are some releases that have come out in recent years of compilations of songs that may have influenced certain Beatles
Yes.
songs. So,
Yep.
and that's interesting to listen to, although if the Beatles haven't admitted it, how do you know for sure? I
Right.
mean, they are the writers. Um, the White Album, at least in my opinion, and at this moment, it's my favorite Beatles album
Okay.
because I really appreciate when artists stretch and are as eclectic as can be when it comes to different musical genres. And I defy anybody to come up with an album that's more eclectic musically than the White Album. Although Revolver is kind of close when you think about it.
Yep.
There's so many styles on Revolver. But it's one of the reasons why I admire the Beatles so much. It's not just the fact that it's eclectic, but every style that they tackled, they did so well. I mean, I love when Paul does his dance hall stuff like Honey Pie. Some people may not go for that kind of thing, but when
Yeah.
he does it well. And then he does a 180 and does Helter Skelter,
Hmm.
and then you've got reggae influence music like Obla Di Obla Da. You've got blues music like Your Blues and Savoy Truffle. You've got country and western with Don't Pass Me By. That's one of the reasons why I love the White Album so much. It's such a stretch, and it's taking the Beatles as far as they could go as a band, stripped down without having too much production and orchestration. Does a little bit on a
Hmm.
good night and all that.
Of course.
But what are the reasons why you in particular really appreciate this particular work?
Well, I go back to when I heard the album for the first time, which would have been, boy, I guess late 70s, early 80s, because I missed the first wave of the Beatles. I'm a second
Mm,
generation Beatles fan.
yeah,
So, and I bought the albums scattershot. I would buy like, Meet the Beatles, and then I would buy Sergeant Pepper and then
right.
start filling in between. So I didn't listen, wasn't introduced to them sequentially. And with the White Album, it really boiled down to the performances, the harmonies, the melodies,
Mm,
and just the sound. I mean, I look at I receive music on a very gut level, and so for me, it's like, does it sound good? And then I start to figure out what the lyrics are, you know.
mm,
And with the Beatles White Album, I mean, it begins with an airplane, a
mm,
jetliner, and it's like, ooh, where's this going? And then it gets into like some great rock and roll, and then all of a sudden it switches to you can almost picture them sitting by a river in India and going into Dear Prudence, that the finger picking,
mm,
that finger picking style. It's quiet and placid, and then all of a sudden the drums start kicking in, and it just like
right.
you never know what to expect. And it just takes you on this journey that zigzags and goes everywhere, and then you end up like listening to this really hard sounding Helter Skelter, and
Mm.
then you get to the song that I would take the needle off the record and skip for years. You could probably guess which one that is.
Long, long, long.
What? No, not that one.
No, I because you just mentioned Helter Skelter,
Oh,
and Long, Long, Long is so much of a contrast to Helter Skelter. And maybe some people that there was such a quiet introduction on
oh
Long, 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 it might have thrown you off. No, Long,
no,
Long, Long, don't get me wrong. Long, Long, Long is a favorite of mine now that I've
sure,
really grown to appreciate. But it was a sleeper for a while for
sure.
many people. But
No,
you must mean Revolution Number
Oh
Nine.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Of
yeah,
course.
okay,
But
yeah.
which as a kid, I could not interpret it. I could not receive it.
Hmm,
Um, and so I would skip that one over. It was only actually, believe it or not, it was only when I was working on this book and I was listening to the White Album like every day for for about a week or two, just to sort of immerse myself. It was only then where I was really able to get through Revolution 9 each time and hear things that I hadn't heard before. I was listening to the box set, the Super Deluxe box set version. And so I was really concentrating on it. And I wouldn't say I learned to appreciate it. I would say I learned to tolerate it, you know? And so, yeah, but taking a step back, listening to all these different musical styles, and then you hit this.
Yes.
You hit this track. It's like, what were people, of that period? What did they make of it back then? If they couldn't handle Tomorrow Never Knows, So I think that's one of the reasons why I like it. It's just that it throws so much at you, and you don't know what you're going to get from track to track when you're listening to it for the first time. When you're listening to it for the 1000th time, which is probably where I am at this point, there's no more surprises, but you can just appreciate the wild journey that it takes you on.
Right. And my colleague, Alan Kozin, who co-hosts Things We Said Today, loves Revolution Number 9 and thinks that it's a brilliant piece of work, and that it was deliberate, that this was a collage that was made to sound like the apocalypse was about to happen. We could say so many times how we wish we had more film footage of the Beatles in the studio, like we did with the Get Back documentary. And you can say that about all their albums. Imagine how interesting it would have been if there was any film footage of watching John and Yoko compile this Revolution Number 9 and what bits they were going to take from EMI's library. And George Harrison, from what I was told, was a little bit involved with Revolution Number 9 as well, but they must have went through a lot of different sounds to pick out what was mixed in there.
It would have been great to have the cameras rolling during that, to see the dynamics between them. Unfortunately, Paul was not involved with Revolution 9. Maybe he would have made it a little bit more palatable to the straights, the straights in the audience. It's been speculated that the reason why he was so opposed to its inclusion on the album was because he wasn't involved. I don't tend to believe that. I tend to believe more it's a matter of something that he said. I found a quote from him where he said that, look, I was just as into avant-garde stuff as John. I was doing all this kind of, I was doing tape loops and all backward masking and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that was my thing. I just didn't think it would belong on a Beatles album.
Right.
And I think that probably was much more, he was thinking commercially. And at that point, John was so in Yoko's headspace that anything that smacked of conventional thinking, he was going to outright lash out against.
And it just goes to show you that Paul, being the diplomat and not wanting to make John upset in any way, let him have his way with Revolution Number 9. Paul was always the most image conscious of all the Beatles. So yeah, it's just a shame. It would have been fascinating if Paul was involved with Revolution Number 9.
Yeah.
And how different it might have been.
And I think that Paul gets a bad rap, and I think that a lot of John's animosity towards a few of the songs that Paul brought to the White Album sessions, I think that it was unfounded. There's nothing wrong with Obla Di Obla Da. It's just a fun lark. It's no worse than Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. I mean, the lyrics in that song are not exactly profound, so I don't know where he was coming from. I mean, maybe it was just that he got bored with working on it over and over again, because Paul was a bit of a perfectionist at that period. But again, with Martha My Dear as well, I mean, big deal. It was inspired by his sheepdog. But if he'd never said that and people didn't know, would they hate it so much? I mean, I've seen so many jabs taken at that. Oh, this is what Paul was writing about at that point, his sheepdog. Well, no, no. If you listen to the song, it could easily be, taken as, a love song or a song about, a troubled relationship.
The
Uh,
sheepdog was the starting point.
exactly,
That's all it was.
exactly, exactly. People just love to take pot shots, and I don't any of them. Not just Paul, but I think that he came in for some undue criticism, for some of that stuff. I don't know why John was so down on some of Paul's stuff during that period. Maybe depending on what the timing was, maybe it was in reaction to Paul's feelings about Revolution 9. Maybe I'm completely off base. I'd have to look at the chronology again.
Hmm.
But it's unfortunate. I think that Paul got a bad rap because I like most of his stuff on that album.
And yet, at times, Paul has said he'd like to release Carnival of Light.
Exactly. Exactly.
So he
Yeah,
was doing that kind of stuff in '67 when he
that's
was
right.
recording that.
Right.
The thing
Yep.
is, if you follow Paul in his solo career, he's exactly the same. Even
Hmm.
though there are those moments on his solo albums where he does experimental things that are somewhat out of character of what you would expect from him, like Cream Crory or Loop, something like that.
Hmm.
For something like the first two Fireman albums,
I was just gonna say.
okay, he doesn't release it as Paul McCartney.
Hmm.
It's got to be under a different name. Same thing with Thrillington, something that's off the wall,
Right.
not what you would expect Paul to do.
Hmm.
It's got to be under a different name.
Right.
Although the third Fireman album, it's the Fireman, but at that point everybody knew, and
Everybody knew.
it was closer to a McCartney album
Yeah.
still,
Yeah.
while being experimental. But Paul has always been aware of this.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
he has that image, and he thinks this is what the public really expects of
Right.
me.
Exactly. Exactly. And so you could see the tug of war, no pun intended, the
Yeah.
tug of war between him and John over. And the thing is, I mean, the song is the track. I hesitate to call it a song. It's like 8.5 minutes. I mean,
Uh-huh.
just think of what could have been on the White Album in its place. Maybe Not Guilty could have been squeezed on. Maybe there could have been maybe Child of Nature could have been finished, or maybe there was another good Paul song that could have, so you got like two more Beatle tracks that we could have gotten in place of this musical mishmash that, probably would have fit better on a, uh uh two virgins part two, or whatever, that
Right.
kind of thing. I would have been more at home on a John and Yoko release on Zapple Records. And I hate to come off as sounding like a snob, but it's just how I feel. And I always have.
Well,
That space, that 8.5 minutes could have been better served.
well, it just goes to show that the Beatles were pushing all boundaries and they could do
Hmm.
anything at all. And you're going to the extreme there.
Right.
So, yeah. I got to ask you the question, since George Martin said that the White Album would have been better as a single album.
I knew this was
And
coming.
and George Harrison felt the same way. And Ringo has said the same thing. Uh, how do you feel about that? Because to me, I grew up on this album when it
Right.
first came out. I'm so used to it the way it is. I kind of feel like what Paul has said. It's the Bloody Beatles. It's a double album. Shut up. I
Okay.
understand that attitude,
Yeah.
but yeah, you can always pick a best of
Sure.
if you want to, but then you're leaving out a lot of great stuff, possibly.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, George literally said, and I think it was 69. He said that it's a lot for somebody to slog through. It's really a tough. It's a long album. We shouldn't have made it a double album because there's just so much material and it's so much to get through.
Hmm.
And then a year later, he puts out a triple disc set.
Yeah.
So let's just put that aside for a second. I have in the past tried to put together a one disc version of the White Album.
Hmm.
I've accomplished it. I tend to lean towards the first disc one,
Uh-huh.
which tends to be the songs that I like the most. However, ultimately, I think that what they should have done in retrospect, hindsight is 2020. What they could have done was just break it into two albums. The White Album. Well, Ringo said this. We should have done the White Album and the Whiter Album, or or maybe the White Album and the Off-White Album. You know,
Okay.
where maybe what you do is you construct it so that the songs are a bit more cohesive, so that they work together more as a unit, the way Rubber Soul worked as a unit, the way Revolver worked. Not a concept album like Sgt. Pepper, but just like there's a consistency to the sound, to the approach. And so the White Album would be all the songs that kind of fit together, and then the Off-White Album would be the other songs. Maybe the Off-White Album is where you put the more eclectic stuff, the more experimental stuff. I'm just talking off the top of my head at this point, but I think maybe that would have been a viable solution. But to whittle it all down to one album, you're right. You lose too many great songs. They might have shown up on other albums down the line. But maybe not all of them. Maybe some of them would have laid on the shelf until the solo careers. But no, I think that ultimately they made the right choice. But I think a viable alternative would have been, two albums, kind of like the way Guns N' Roses innovated it with Use Your Illusions 1 and 2. Maybe the Beatles could have blazed that trail and done, the White Album 1, the White Album 2, or the Off-White, whatever. I think that would have been a viable thing too. I mean, it really depends. I mean, the thing is that the people who love how eclectic and how varied it is, they would hate the idea of making them sound more consistent with each other, the songs. So, so I probably just pissed off a certain segment of your audience by even suggesting that.
We all have different opinions here, and I'm sure there's plenty of times people don't agree with my point of view. But I happen to feel that because the Beatles music is so strong, you get used to these songs in this order, in this sequence. I can't picture, as soon as I hear one song, I think of the next one automatically. I hear it in my head. And that's also because the songs are that good. And, there are plenty of people that defend the American Beatles albums. And in many cases, the sequencing on the American albums, you'll have like 6 songs in a row that were the same 6 songs in a row that were on the British album.
Right.
But they all make sense. And it just, I guess because the songs are that good, your ears will become accustomed to it and it'll work that way. But then you've got certain songs, especially the lighter ones on side 2, that work so well together. Whether it's Blackbird and, going into, whatever, Rocky Raccoon and Don't Pass Me By. And those songs work so well, stylistically, sound-wise, and into I Will and Julia, they all work that way. Like it's, almost a lot of acoustic stuff, I think the sequencing makes a lot of sense.
That was the point I was going to raise, and I'm glad you brought it up. Is the sequencing is one of the real strengths of the White Album. It is a really well paced album. Whereas like with the Beach Boys, for example, I have found myself resequencing some of their albums to make them work better to my ear. And in some cases, I prefer, my sequencing rather than the ones that they did. I'm talking about the later albums, like in the late 60s, going into the early 70s. Yeah. I don't do that with the Beatles. I can't do that with the Beatles. It's they knew what they were doing. And they were masterful in that. And so like I said, I've tried to distill the White Album down to one. I did it. I wasn't happy with the results.
Yeah. Well, I definitely feel that should have been and always will be a double album for me. So, yeah. Are you of the opinion? Well, you kind of talked about it before, but would you take out a couple of songs? Would you, if you had the choice here, would you take out Revolution number 9? Some people would take out Wild Honey Pie. Do you really need Wild Honey Pie? And then put in, say, Not Guilty or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, I would. I mean, Wild Honey Pie was very self-indulgent. There was no real need for that to be on the album.
It's only a
Especially since
minute. It's only a minute.
I know, but it's I mean, that's one of the cases where it was Paul doing all of the instruments. It was just a Paul track.
Hmm.
So it's not even really a Beatles track. So yeah, I would have gotten rid of that. I hate to, again, I hate to offend all the, Revolution 9 fans out there, but given my druthers, yeah, I would have taken Revolution 9 off and put another 2 or 3 songs if you can fit them on there. Would one of them have been Not Guilty? Maybe. I personally would have loved to hear the Beatles do Sour Milk Sea. That would have been awesome. Uh, that was in the ether at the time.
Right.
And I think Paul might have had Teddy Boy written at that point. Maybe that would have been
Well,
up for consideration, or
well, he had Junk.
he had Junk. Junk would have been great. Junk would
That
have
would have
been,
fit.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of what John had laying around at that point, like we said before, I mean, Child of Nature was there. I mean, maybe he would have rejected it because he didn't like the lyrics or whatever. But yeah, I think we could have gotten some 2 or 3 really great Beatles tracks uh, in place of Revolution 9, and I would have preferred that.
Hmm. There's been speculation, and again, it's speculation,
Mhm.
that Child of Nature wasn't included because they already had Mother Nature's Son. So it was another nature song.
Right, right.
So I guess that was the reason. We don't really know for sure.
We don't know for sure. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Just want your opinion on something because it's always fun to ask other big Beatle fans this question,
Okay.
especially with Revolver getting all of the acclaim that it's gotten in recent years. I
Hmm.
shouldn't say recent, it's been decades, really.
Yeah, yeah.
For years and years, I kept hearing Sergeant Pepper is the Beatles at their peak, and now there are people who think Revolver is at their peak.
Hmm.
Is there any particular time in the Beatles canon there where you think it was a peak, or did they continue to, keep topping themselves? Because some people think couldn't get any better than Abbey Road at
Hmm.
the end. How do you fit the White Album in all of this? Tough question, huh?
Well, it's one that requires consideration. I mean, I think that the White Album was, and I described this in the book. It's a nexus point.
Hmm.
It's a nexus point. It connects their present to the future. It is a signpost for what lies ahead.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of like, in some ways it's a turning point. It's still them at the peak of their powers.
Right.
I think that Abbey Road showed that the White Album wasn't the end of their peak.
Hmm.
I think that Abbey Road is as good as anything that they did. I think that's right up there. In fact, I would place Abbey Road a bit higher with, say, Rubber Soul and Revolver, in the very top echelon of the Beatles canon.
Yeah.
Um, Sergeant Pepper's not my favorite Beatles album. I don't think it ever was.
Hmm.
The White Album isn't my favorite Beatles album. I don't think it ever was. No, it never was. It never was my favorite. I think that you can see the I just think that in terms of the what's on the vinyl, so to speak, or what's on the CD now, or what's on the MP3. I think that they still had a lot of great work ahead of them after the White Album. And that work was Abbey Road. To a lesser extent, I mean, I think Let It Be is fine. I don't think it represents them at their best.
Hmm.
But there's some great stuff on Let It Be as well. Abbey Road, I think, is a more cohesive showcase for them at the peak of their powers.
Okay. That's well put. There's a difference between what you consider to be their most creative and just what you think is their best work. It can be
Mhm.
something completely different.
Right.
You could look at Revolver because, all these years I listened to Revolver first as an American album.
Mhm.
Once you
Me
got
too.
used to the British album and you
Right.
compared it to the British Rubber Soul, it's like night and day,
Yeah. Yep.
and it's like, oh my God, how much growth can a band have
Right.
between two albums? And
Right.
so I'm just so blown away by Revolver these days. And
Hmm.
yet, still, the White Album's my favorite Beatles album. And you
Okay.
can say that they continue to make great albums with Sgt. Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road. But was Revolver a creative peak? There's a distinction between that and just continuing to put out great music
Right.
on a high level.
I think it was them at their most. Yeah, I would say I would agree that on a creative level, the White Album was a creative peak
Oh,
because there is so much going on that album, and they're going in so many different directions. Whereas with the Abbey Road is much more of it's more conventional. Despite the fact that you've got that medley on side two,
mm,
but the sheer experimentation, the sheer going, let's try this sound, let's try that sound, let's try this kind of music, let's try that kind of music.
mm.
I mean, yeah, the White Album, I would say, is a creative peak because they're just doing so many different things. So yeah, I can sort of amend my opinion and say, creatively speaking, yeah, the White Album was a peak.
Okay, very good. I love hearing different opinions, whether I agree with them
Hmm.
or not,
Oh,
and
sure.
anyone can make a case for Revolver, I'm sure, when you consider how much they branched out there as a single album and also the different
Right.
sounds that they achieved in the
Hmm.
studio.
And all while giving George that bigger slice of the pie.
Right. Yeah, but you also have the benefit with the White Album that it's two albums worth of material, so they could
True.
even push
Right.
even
Go even
further and
further.
do even more.
Sure. Absolutely.
All right, let's get your final thoughts here on the state of the Beatles today. And what are your thoughts about Now and Then about to come out? Are you
Yeah.
excited about it?
I've been hearing about it for 30 years. So yeah, I'd like to finally hear it already. Yeah, I'm curious. I'm definitely curious. I think it probably will benefit from the new technology that Peter Jackson brought to the table
Hmm.
with the Get It Be document. Get It Be. Get Back documentary. Um, and so it'll be interesting. I would hope that they will now go back in and use that technology on Free as a Bird and Real Love so that John doesn't sound like he's in the next room singing through a tin can.
Mhm.
That ghostly voice, I'd much rather hear him more prominent, and they've got the technology now where they can do that. I would hope that they'll do that. I don't think those two songs are so precious and held in the same regard as the official Beatles canon that you can't touch them. I think that they would benefit from that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to Now and Then. I'm looking forward to hearing it. I'm not someone who sort of turns his nose up at Real Love and Free as a Bird. I like those songs.
Hmm.
I enjoy them. I still listen to them. They still, pop into my head every now and then, no pun intended. So yeah, considering that it's a song that we were supposed to get on Anthology 3,
Hmm.
yeah, I'm fine with it coming out. I don't object to it.
Yeah, the only problem that I have is that, and I'm sure that all four parties at Apple are only acting in, the best behalf of all four of them. Yoko and Sean for John, and Olivia and Danny for George, and all that. But for someone like Paul, who has always said the Beatles were a democracy and nothing went out as the Beatles unless all four parties approved it,
Mhm.
that George didn't like the recording of Now and Then when they
Right.
worked on it. But the question is, did he just not like it because of the sound quality and there was a buzz going through it, or did he just not like the song? So, you have to entrust, in the case of George, Olivia, and Danny, for knowing how George would feel, you know? And there are plenty of Beatle fans still who do not look at Free as a Bird,
Right.
Real Love as real Beatles songs. And
Hmm.
I've never, ever understood that, because there's so many Beatles recordings, as we have mentioned here, that don't even have all four of them on it, and they go out as the Beatles.
Right.
So where is the logic there? Why
Right.
why was Yesterday a Beatles recording when the other three Beatles had nothing to do with it? You know,
Hmm.
basically a Paul McCartney and George Martin producing and arranging the strings there, and
Right.
yet that goes out as the Beatles.
Hmm. And they all supported it. They were all in favor of it. They were fine with it going out as a Beatles track. Paul himself has said that the reason why the song didn't come out is because George said it was rubbish.
Yeah.
And George and Paul has always maintained for as long as the song was put aside, he kept saying, I want that to go out. One of these days I'm going to put it out. I'm going to put it out. So this has been something that's been on his mind for many, many years. The same way Let It Be Naked was something that he wanted,
Hmm.
out for many, many years. And eventually George did consent to it.
Right.
And you could speculate that maybe Paul would have worn George down after all these years if he was still here.
Yeah, well, it's just that it's been like a credo with Paul, saying that, they were the ultimate democracy. Nothing went
Right.
out unless all four parties agreed to it. And if George said this was rubbish, did he mean he just didn't like the song, period? Or he
Right.
just didn't like the sound
The
quality
sound
at the
quality.
time? So I don't really know for a fact,
We'll
there.
see. They were the ultimate democracy until around 1969. Because if they were the ultimate democracy, all four had to agree. You know, there never would have been an Alan Klein. There never would have been, the Phil Spector version of the Long and Winding Road. So yeah, it's Paul says a lot of things. Is the bottom line.
Huh. It's funny because on Things We Said Today, one of my podcasts, Mark Lewison had
Mhm.
written to Alan Kozin in response to his book of
Mhm.
the McCartney legacy, gave
Oh,
him 40 pages there. And he noted that there was an interview that Paul gave on the radio where he was asked about Phil Spector's production on The Long and Winding Road, and he said he didn't
yeah.
mind it.
Hmm.
So that's changing his tune there from what we've been led to believe.
Sure, but we know that for the re-release, the Super Deluxe re-release, he did go in and ask Giles Martin to turn the strings way, way, way down. That's something that, and Giles Martin was like, Paul, I mean, you're tampering with it's the canon. This is the official. And Paul was like, please just turn the strings down. The harp, I think it was the harp. We'll turn the harp down, turn the strings down, turn the chord. And the funny thing is, when I was working on the Beatles trivia book,
Hmm.
I went in and listened to every single released version of The Long and Winding Road. The Blue Album version,
Uh-huh.
the original Let It Be release, the Anthology 3 release, and all that. And let's put it this way, each one of them sounds completely different from each other. So they've been tampering with that for years now, the Long and Winding Road. And I think that Paul in particular, I believe him when he says he was never happy with it. The fact that he still was asking Giles Martin to de-emphasize a lot of what Spector had added
Hmm.
to me says, yeah, he wasn't okay with it.
And yet there are times when Paul has done the song in concert and the arrangement is very close to what,
Yeah, I know.
Phil Spector did. So how do you know? How do you know for sure?
Look, if we have to give John a lot of leeway for his inconsistencies, we've got to do the same for Paul.
And Mark Lewison said that that letter that Paul had written
Yeah,
to Phil Spector at the time, that was something that John Eastman was behind, and that was more of a power play thing because of Alan Klein and Phil Spector working together.
sure.
So I don't know. It's hard to know what to believe, you know.
Well, I mean, it was authorized to run in the anthology book. So, if it was just that, maybe, I tend to think it was more to it than just that. Paul was talking about that in the interview, the post breakup interview in April of 1970, when he was talking to Ray Connolly. He was
Mhm.
talking about how he wasn't happy with the mix on Long and Winding Road, and he sent a letter and was waiting for a response. So, power play or not, I mean, it was something that he brought up to Ray Connolly in the aftermath of his announcement, his "I'm taking a break" announcement.
Mm. And of course, his opinion about that could have changed over the years too,
True.
about the mix.
Hmm.
So are you excited about the Red and Blue albums being remixed?
I'm curious because those are the only CDs that I do not have in my collection,
Hmm.
because I figure, well, I've got everything already. What do I need this for? If they put the single version of Help with that James Bond
Hmm.
opening, if they put that on the Red album, I'll buy the Red album. I'm curious to hear the remixes and all that, but I really want that James Bond opening to Help.
That the
That
James Bond one was on the Red album, but that wasn't the single mix of Help.
Oh, well, it's on a single that I've got, believe it or not.
The single is on in the singles box set. I'm trying to remember now. Um,
I know I'm
no,
talking about a vinyl. I have a vinyl single
right.
of Help, which
Okay.
has the James Bond the James Bond lead in.
Okay.
So, and when I had the Red album when I was a kid, the vinyl, it had the James Bond opening as well. So, but my understanding is that on the CDs, it's not there. But with this reissue, this remix, I'm hoping that they'll put it back on. And if it does, I will I will
If I
purchase it.
remember correctly, my Red album had the James Bond intro.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the vinyl.
Well, I haven't played the vinyl for a while. Must be the CD. I'll have to check.
You'll have
It's
to
been a
check. My
while.
understanding is that it was never on the CD.
Okay.
Yeah. In terms of the Blue album, yeah, I mean, if I get the red, I'm gonna get the blue. I'm that kind of nut. I've heard rumors that they might be adding to the Blue album. I'm concerned about that. My feeling is that they should put them out the way they originally were. And if you're going to add any stuff, like for example, Now and Then, or remixes of Free as a Bird and Real Love, put it on something else.
Hmm.
Leave the Blue album the way it was. That's supposed to be 1967 to 1970, not 1967 to 2023.
Hmm.
That's my feeling.
Yeah, well, there are rumors that those three songs will be tacked on to the Blue album, but at this stage, as we're doing this interview, it's just that's the rumor, and we're supposed
Yeah.
to be hearing news like any day now
Hmm.
as for what's going to happen. But the Red album in particular, you could fit all the songs on the Red album on one disc.
Hmm.
So there's plenty of room to add to that, and they
Sure.
really should as a CD. So I understand you wanted to keep everything intact, be true to the way it first came out, but there's so much more time-wise you can fit on the Red if you're going to have a double CD.
When you say add, are you talking about like other released songs and just make it more of a greatest hits from that period?
Yeah,
Or are you
from
saying,
62 to 66, songs that weren't on the original Red
okay,
album.
so you're not talking about like alternate takes and,
No, no, no,
okay.
no.
Hmm.
And one of the few, at least now, problems with the Red album is that Revolver was so shortchanged. There was only two tracks from Revolver on the whole
Right.
collection,
And
and Rubber
and
Soul
Rubber Soul
has
was very
like,
well
yeah,
represented.
five or
Yeah.
six, I think,
Yeah.
from Rubber Soul.
Hmm.
So yeah, you can make a lot of changes with the Red album. Plus, if these are remixes, you're going to get a lot of new remixes that you haven't
Yeah.
heard before,
Right. So
especially on
what
the early stuff.
so what do you think? What do you think is the likeliest thing they're going to do? Add to the expand 62 to 66?
I hope that they put more songs on 62
Hmm.
to 66.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know how much more they're going to add to the Blue album. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a rumor that there'll be three extra tracks, and it
Right.
would be Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then. But that, we could find out in a day or two that's completely wrong.
Right.
So
And have you heard, I mean, have they gone in and remixed Free as a Bird and Real Love to
I haven't
make,
heard yet.
okay.
I, they have to do that, if not now, eventually.
Yeah.
The door is wide open for that. It screams for that.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
does.
I applaud Jeff Lynne for the work that he did with the limitations that he had
At the
with just a
time.
cassette.
Yeah.
Just that's where AI really benefits if you've got
Right.
a mono recording and everything is all on one track and
Yeah.
you got to separate everything.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I've learned to temper my expectations with what we're going to get after being somewhat disappointed with the release of the Let It Be box set.
Hmm.
There's such good stuff that I have on bootleg that I was so hoping for high quality audio. And we didn't get it. We didn't get a disc of the entire rooftop concert. We didn't get a full band performance of All Things Must Pass. And I've got a couple of great performances
Hmm.
of the Beatles doing All Things Must Pass all the way through. And we did not get that for whatever reason. So I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to be really, really surprised pleasantly.
Yeah. Well, Let It Be was one of the few disappointments for me for a box
Hmm.
set because you
Yeah,
did have two discs of outtakes that you could have fit on one CD.
sure.
I'm not a big fan of let's put the singles at the time, the mono and the stereo on one CD. That's more of a cost for the fan. If
Hmm.
you could fit everything on one or two discs, do it. But
Right.
there's so many outtakes that of the Beatles working on certain songs that even if they're not complete, they're interesting.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
I think that the fans out there would not have complained if it cost a little bit more to have a lot of material, a lot more
Hmm.
material.
Hmm.
So, but at the same time, the White Album is a gem.
Yeah,
They did the White Album really right. Couldn't
absolutely.
have asked for more from the White Album.
No, no, the fact that we got the Escher demos and all that stuff was terrific. That was a crowning achievement. And so yeah, well, I'm curious. I am certainly open to getting the Red and Blue re-releases. They'll be my first time I'm purchasing them on
Hmm.
CD.
Yeah. Well, there's one good thing that I could say. There should be a lot of good things that I could say about Universal because every single year they put out something on the Beatles.
Hmm.
And that's just so important to keep their name out there.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
from the Sergeant Pepper box set on, even if we didn't have a box set. The one year we didn't get the Let It Be box, we had the Get Back documentary. So
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
found something else to release.
Right.
So that's extremely important.
Hmm.
It means that there are going to be more articles written about the Beatles. It means there are going to be more podcast shows talking about these new releases, and it creates that buzz, which is oh so important. So
Agreed. And
all right,
hopefully more bookazines too.
that's true. Hey, between the Beatles and the solo stuff, you can go till you're 90.
Pretty much.
And then you do a lot of other bookazines, which maybe we should get into at some point.
Okay, sure.
But thank you, Glenn, for doing this.
Thanks for
This has
having
been
me.
enlightening, and we look forward to the next bookazine that is Beatle related. Do you have one already in the pipeline?
Not in the pipeline. My next two are completely non-Beatles related.
Right.
But it's hopefully I'll be able to circle back to them at some point in the near future. But right now I'm going into some different areas, which is nice because it means that I don't get too bored on any one particular topic. And I'd
Hmm.
hate to get bored with the Beatles.
I think that's impossible. That's a sure thing. So once again, Glenn's new bookazine, The Making of the Beatles White Album. Make sure you pick it up. There'll be all kinds of links in the description box for Glenn's work, Glenn's other work, his other appearances here on this channel. So check that out. Thanks to all of you for watching. Glenn, thanks as always for being such a great guest.
Thank you.
And see you next time, folks.